Hey folks, I'm Brown Bear. Recently, Blizzard reached out to the community soliciting feedback on the ladder matchmaker for Warcraft III Reforged. I thought I would put together a video offering my own perspective on how I think this system should work. For reference, I've previously written in depth on the ladder design of StarCraft II and Counter-Strike Global Offensive. If you're interested in reading more, I've included a link in the description below. The first thing to consider is the mechanism for matchmaking. Warcraft III is a competitive game, so its matchmaker should leverage a skill-based rating. Glicko 2 is a good choice here given how successful it's been across a large range of games. It's also public domain and relatively easy to implement. One detail is how aggressively this system should deal with rating volatility. StarCraft II has taken multiple approaches over its lifetime. At the launch of Legacy, it could place a new account into Masters within just 20 games. After free-to-play, the developers tuned this back to a more incremental model, to ensure newer players were never placed in too high of a league. I would recommend a similar concession given the expected influx of new players after the launch of Reforged. Next is how ratings should be split out across multiple game modes. StarCraft II is again a good model here, not only because it's iterated on this over the past several years, but also because its original design was based on the implementation in Warcraft III. In 1 vs 1, StarCraft II assigns separate ratings for each race. This means I could be rating 5,000 with Terran, but only 4,500 with Zerg. 1 vs 1 and team ratings are also separate. Players receive a unique rating for each unique arranged team they participate in, plus a separate random team rating if they're queuing by themselves or with a partially filled-in party. The trade-off here is tricky. The more fine-grained the system, the more it optimizes for accuracy over a large number of games. But this also means more inaccuracy if the number of games is small. In StarCraft, I'm almost always inadvertently smurfing when I play 3 vs 3 or 4 vs 4. I never play enough to get myself rated properly before my rating eventually decays. But the system works well for players who play often, and over the course of a huge number of games, the number of smurf games ends up relatively small. So the only suggestion I'd make here would be to set up sensible defaults for team game ratings based on a player's 1 vs 1 rating. If a player is, say, in the top 5% of 1v1, start them higher than the base rating in a team mode they haven't done placements for. The next question is how to handle random in 1 vs 1. I would discourage giving it its own rating, because it's not actually a separate race. Instead, on the client side, make random invisibly select a race before queuing. I previously made a video suggesting how this could be handled on the matchmaker side instead of the client side. While I think this would be a better long-term solution, it's also more complex to implement, and the development resources would likely be better spent elsewhere. Another thing to consider is whether to include unranked. Unranked enables players to continue laddering without experiencing the stress or anxiety of ranked play. The problem is that unranked by itself is relatively unpopulated. StarCraft solved this problem by giving players separate unranked and ranked MMRs, but then joining the unranked and ranked queues together. This leads many players to use unranked as a form of informal smurfing. It's impossible for an outsider to know how many players use unranked for good reasons compared to how many abuse it in order to smurf. I'd recommend the Reforged developers look at the data from StarCraft and make a decision accordingly. In an ideal world, unranked would be an objectively good feature, but in practice it has trade-offs that should be considered carefully. Arguably the most controversial question is the matchmaking logic for teams. StarCraft allows randomly created teams to match with arranged teams, which is arguably unfair. Arranged teams often have prepared strategies and are using voice chat or other mechanisms to coordinate their play. In an ideal world, random teams would never be matched with arranged ones. In practice, this would lead to higher queue times. Queue times is a sensitive subject. If it gets too high, some players will simply give up on queuing, which leads to even higher queue times and even more players leaving. This is a vicious cycle, and it's occurred in practically every RTS I've ever played. I empathize with random players who play solo and come up against arranged teams, and I get that these players pay an individual price for what is arguably a public good in the form of queue times. But as happy as I would be to be proven wrong, I don't think it's feasible to separate these queues. StarCraft II is arguably the most popular competitive real-time strategy game ever made, and yet it still couldn't make this distinction work. Unless Reforged somehow ends up being more popular, the question isn't whether you make a trade-off, but what you actually sacrifice. Whether it's queue times, average rating difference between teams, connection quality, or something else. Allowing arranged teams to play against random ones seems like one of the less imperfect solutions. Next is the question of regionalization. The ideal is pretty straightforward. Reforged should leverage dedicated servers in order to guarantee consistent connection quality. Players should be able to select the regions they're willing to play on and queue for any of them from a single gateway, ideally simultaneously if they'd like. Constructing a meaningful ladder system might be tricky in this case, but the simple solution is to just segment ratings by region. The problem is that it's not clear whether the BattleNet infrastructure can actually support any of this. If a single gateway isn't possible, then selecting a region prior to logging in seems like the next best thing. If the Reforged team isn't going to move to dedicated servers, hopefully they can add an option like maximum acceptable ping. The last thing I'll say on this is that the matchmaker should feature some notion of search banding. When you first queue, it should try to find the best match possible, but the longer a team searches, the more the search band should expand to include more and more players. The key here is to keep queue times low. As soon as they become too high, players leave the ecosystem and it becomes difficult to recover. Next, I'd like to move a layer up in the stack. So far, we've been talking about the nuts and bolts of ratings. In this next section, I'd like to dive into how this is actually presented to the user. Let's start with leagues. Leagues are a great feature because they're more intuitive than ratings. It's easier to think about a league like Diamond than it is to think about an arbitrary rating number. Both should be visible, but from experience, the one that ends up mattering to most players is the league. Percentile-based leagues also have the advantage of allowing the rating system to scale across time periods. Something like Masters League is understandable by anyone who's played the game at any time. This improves player retention because the core concepts of the multiplayer are durable even in the face of numerical changes to the ratings. The question then is how many leagues there should be and how they should be organized. I would recommend bringing over the league and tier system of StarCraft so that not only is there consistency across time periods, but also across franchises as well. This increases engagement not just with Warcraft, but with Blizzard properties more generally. In terms of the number of leagues, I don't think there's a magic number here. For reference, StarCraft II has 19 unique levels, CSGO has 18. I'm sure something around there is probably fine. What I think is more important is the actual distribution. Mid-tier leagues should be relatively large because players can move through them quite quickly, whereas upper-tier leagues should be smaller to convey the significance of the skill level and the difficulty in improving further. In terms of placements, I would recommend minimizing the number of games players need to receive a rating and a league border. To me, the rating system is much less engaging when a player is stuck in placements. Players like to see their rating, and they like to work toward improving it, so getting them into a league as soon as possible is the ideal. I would further include a Grandmaster League because it's quite exciting to work your way into, and it's a nice badge of honor for top-level players. I would, however, make it percentile-based instead of a fixed number of players. Fixed numbers just don't scale well. In StarCraft, getting Grandmaster at the beginning of the season is essentially indistinguishable from Masters 1. Allowing the size of Grandmaster to scale with the size of the player base makes more sense to me. Next, I would recommend breaking up the rating system into 4 or 5 seasons per year. Seasons are great because they're a natural engagement mechanism. You can pair a new season with new features, new maps, new tweaks to the UI, and so forth. The start of a new season is like a call to action that draws players back into the game. Resetting leagues at the start of every season also makes it feasible to eliminate demotions. Players always have the league border of the highest league they've achieved this season, but the league system still retains its accuracy because players re-earn their league status in every new season. Rating decay is a trickier subject. If it's too slow, players are disincentivized from returning to the game after long breaks. If it's too fast, you essentially force players to smurf. Season-based decay is an intuitive approach because seasons typically align with changes to the game, like balance updates and changes to the map pool. The more seasons a player has been inactive, the more changes they're unfamiliar with, and the more work they'll need to do to catch up on the meta. In this last section, I'd like to talk about the user interface. On the queuing side, I would recommend map vetoes if Blizzard plans to regularly add and remove maps from the competitive map pool. This is essential not only for balance reasons, but also to grant players more agency over their experience. Once players find a game, I would omit league borders or other rating indicators from the loading screen unless players explicitly opt in through the game options. From my perspective, these features create ladder anxiety without any clear benefits. I would also allow users to hide ratings on the post-game screen if they so desire. In general, visible MMR is a good feature that increases transparency and serves those players trying to track their own progress. If players want to know their opponent's MMR, they should be able to do so. But if players find it anxiety-inducing to see their rating change with every game, they should at least be able to hide it from themselves. I would further recommend a reasonable profile experience that surfaces a player's current rating, their current league, their historical ladder performance, and a bunch of other data like match history and racial and map statistics. I don't think I've ever watched a StarCraft stream that didn't make heavy use of these features. They seem to me like a must-have. On the same token, I would expose this data through the Battle.net Developer API so that community members can construct their own analyses and slices of the data. The last thing worth thinking about is how to address smurfing. To me, the most elegant solution has always been brute force. If players want to create a new account, they need to buy a new copy of the game. Simple, but effective. The problem is that this is incompatible with a free-to-play business model, which Reforged may want to pursue in the future. It's also incongruent with how Warcraft III historically functioned. A potential middle ground solution is to lock out access to the ladder until an account has completed a certain number of games in other game modes. Another potential idea would be something like the trust factor in CSGO, in which new accounts only get paired with each other, at least until they accumulate more experience. Alrighty, that's everything I had for today. I hope that I provided enough detail and that the reasoning and impact of each suggestion was clear. If you have any feedback, definitely feel free to let me know in the comments down below. I'd also love it if you followed me here and on Twitter and Facebook to receive regular content updates. The relevant links are in the description below. All the best, and see you next time.